Welcome back, everyone. We are now on chapter number 3 of this Introduction to Machine Learning course, right? In the first chapter, we just did the basics of statistical learning, and the second chapter was on regression, linear regression. We touched on simple linear regression and then multiple linear regression. At the end, we discussed a few concepts that are very important when we're doing regression, right? In this chapter, we are going to do classification. Going to move on to classification. If you remember well, we said machine learning is divided into supervised. So there's supervised and then unsupervised learning, right? Supervised and supervised learning. And supervised learning, where we're focusing on supervised learning in this course. So supervised learning is divided into regression problems and then classification problems. So we've touched on regression. Now we're moving on to classification problems, right? We're going to go back to regression later, where we discuss other ways to make regression better, because the way we did it was just an introduction. We're going to discuss methods that will make regression and also classification methods that we're going to discuss here even better. So let's get into let's introduce classification. Basically, when we did linear regression, our y we were predicting was quantitative. If you remember well, this was quantitative, right? It was something like predicting income level or price of a good. In the example that we had, we were predicting sales based on advertising budgets in TV, radio, and newspaper. So sales that we're predicting, they were quantitative, right? But now, when it comes to classification, our y becomes qualitative. It is now a qualitative variable. It's a qualitative variable, right? So what that means is our y is composed of categories. Let's just say k categories. K being an integer, so it can be 10 categories, 2 categories, or instead of categories, we can call them classes, right? K classes. We usually say classes and not categories, but they mean the same thing. For example, if we want to predict the gender of a person based on their height, weight, pitch of voice, etc., right? What we are predicting, the gender, the y here, is a qualitative variable. I think you agree, it's a qualitative variable. And our data could have two classes or 2 categories, right? So it will have maybe female and male. So we're predicting those two, isn't it? So that is what? That is predicting whether someone is female or male falls under classification. Another example could be something like what diseases are in a person's DNA strand, right? So let's when we look at a person's DNA sequence data, we might want to see what diseases this person might have later on in life, right? So the diseases, they are qualitative because they are categories or classes, right? They are qualitative. They're just words, right? So since they are categories like that, we'll have to do classification. So someone might be asking, how would you classify? Some methods classify based on probabilities. What is the probability of the person having this disease, probability of having this one, or probability of having that one? And then they compare the probabilities. The one with the highest probability, that will probably be the diagnosis. That will be the diagnosis of the person, right? So some methods, they calculate probabilities of an observation belonging to a class, and then they assign it to a class with the highest probability. in that case, when they are calculating probability, they sort of act like regression, because probabilities are numeric, right? They are numeric variables. So they sort of act like regression. We're going to see a method soon that does something like this, right? And that method, let me just write what the structure of that. The method will be something called logistic regression. Logistic regression. Don't be confused. When you see regression, you think it falls under regression chapter. No. Logistic regression is actually a classifying algorithm. And it classifies using probabilities. It classifies using these probabilities. And we'll do another one called the LDA, or linear discriminant analysis. It's also a classifying algorithm. It's also a classifying algorithm that does the probabilities as well. Right? And then there's another famous one called k-nearest neighbors. I think we did an example in the previous. I think it was in the first chapter where we were introducing statistical learning. We gave an example of k-nearest neighbors. We might just touch on it, but this we have already done k-nearest neighbors. We'll see this in a lab. Because the theory we have already discussed it, right? Other ones that we'll discuss later on, not in this chapter, GAMs, so generalized additive methods. So trees. So it's going to be your trees or random forests. So tree-based methods like random forests, and we're going to look at boosting methods and SVMs, which are your support vector machines. So all these are classification algorithms. They're classification algorithms. In this chapter, we'll do these two, and then this we already did, so we'll do it in the lab. JMs, we'll see them later. I think we'll see them later if we don't do these in this chapter. So like always, we're going to have our training set. That is X1, our observations, and Y1. Y1 being the class that these responses or predictors belong to. So let's say it's the pitch of the person, the height, whatever it is inside this X. Then we'll see in our training observation, is it a male or a female. So we're going to have our X1 up to our Xn, like always, right? And we are going to perform our classification on that. So in the next chapter, someone might be asking, okay, when you're already doing probability, right? You're calculating probability and then assigning to a class. Why not just use linear regression that calculates probability, and when you have the probability, you predict what class it's going to be. In the next video, we're going to discuss why we cannot use probability, or why it's difficult for us to use probability in this case. So stay tuned for that video.